That was great.
Great.
This is the first one that I've actually watched from the front row and came up that direction.
Well,
so
I'm glad.
I didn't want to miss anything because I know it's a lot to keep up with you.
I hope it's interesting.
I was telling Balaji backstage, last time we hung out in person was the day that I announced the idea of Messari and SF in late 2017. Then we caught up a few times when you were at Coinbase. Coinbase became a big partner. You invested. And then we caught up at the beginning of the COVID, and we were early to decentralize. And now we've got this great remote first.
Done really well,
Team and company, and that seems to be going pretty well. So my question for you is, clearly I need to start a country now, right? Like,
well, so
this would solve two birds with one stone. My team doesn't think that I'm going to leave to run for office. You know, I can just be king. So it's like
well, here's the thing.
This is a natural evolution, right?
So there's a great video to Google, okay, which is from 1790 to 2050. So it says 1790 to 2050 U.S. states population over time. Okay, leave aside the 2050 part because that's all extrapolation. But what it shows is from 1790 to 2020, and I'll answer your question in a second. Different U.S. states were attracting people from other states. For example, at the beginning of the United States, like Virginia was a big deal. Quickly, New York passed it, and it was attracting from others. And then actually, in the early 1800s, Ohio was like really gaining. That's why Ohio is like father of presidents. It was a big deal in the mid 1800s. 7 presidents came from there. Mid 1800s, you had Indiana and Illinois. That's why Lincoln Douglas was happening over there. Then by the early 1900s, you have California rising, especially after the Great Depression. And then by the end of the 20th century, you suddenly see Florida and Texas coming up, right? So I mentioned that the US is a nation of immigrants. Of course, everybody knows that one. It's also a nation of emigrants from other countries. But the third way of thinking about it, it's a nation of internal immigrants between states. And now Florida and Texas are capturing lots of folks from California and New York. How does this relate to your point? Basically, just like trades between currency pairs, every trade between Bitcoin and ETH, between ZEC and Monero, gives us information about the relative, it's like PageRank, like one is linking to the other or vice versa, and you can have sort of you can turn into a coat hanger or like a hanging of which currencies outrank others generally, which would people prefer to be in, right? Those hops. And that changes over time, but you can get a measure. Now, the next Elon, maybe Ryan, can literally start with one person. And just like you have the competition between US states, you have the competition between network states. And so you go from one person and 10 people and 100 people and 1,000 people. And so the next Elon can start the next California. But it starts from one thing, and then it becomes a political unit over time as it grows, right? This is not something we're used to thinking about, but what's Pennsylvania, William Penn, right? Texas, Sam Houston. There were individuals once upon a time that actually did lay the groundwork for these communities. So I know it sounds crazy. And you may not necessarily need to get to, quote, country scale, because that's like starting a new company and saying it's going to become Google, right? But could you become, like, for sure, the mayor of a small town online? I think for sure, right?
Value alignment is such an important part of kind of establishing the DNA of a country or network state, as you've talked about it. And companies have that, right? That, they have the founder, they have the kind of team that's created the core culture, they have like a unified vision, a kind of a direction that they're taking things. Do you think that some of the early network states, maybe we can drill down on the definition a little bit, like what does this look like? You mentioned maybe the first, few, they're laughed at, they look like toys. But could you also consider a large company a network state if a politically oriented founder kind of took their company in that direction? And so like, what would it look like if you were just creating MVPs of little network states versus a big company spending more time looking like a network state or kind of taking on some of these attributes?
I don't think it's impossible. I think it is just like it's sort of hard for Google to become a cryptocurrency, right? Like sort of a bit of a category error or whatever. I think it would be challenging, not necessarily impossible, but challenging for sort of an existing thing to, quote, become a network state. One of the things I go through in the book is there's lots of things that are, because the definition that I've got there, the diplomatic recognition piece is really the thing that makes it state-like. Why? Because you are then actually sovereign over territory. Now, the thing about this is, I actually identify a lot of intermediate points and a lot of things that are close to network states but not exactly the same thing, at least as I define them. So what are the intermediate points? So like a startup society, you're just one guy with a dollar and a dream. Okay, Zuck had his computer, right, in 2004. it is then you have a network union, which is an online group, purely digital, that's capable of collective action. Then a network archipelago, which is capable of a very important kind of collective action, which is crowdfunding territory and living together. And then over time, that network archipelago gets recognition from a Kiribati or a Tuvalu, and that's when it becomes a network state. And you know what that is? That's like the fiat crypto bridge. Okay, just like when Satoshi did Bitcoin, people didn't know at the beginning how important people thought you could just bootstrap the Bitcoin economy on its own right. It turned out that actually that legitimation and that migration of value and so on back and forth, even if it's just a thin pipe between fiat currencies and cryptocurrencies was crucial. In the same way, the bridge between fiat countries and crypto countries, between fiat passports and crypto passports, that's going to be a major next step for us, all of us.
Let me be a little bit more precise. Sure. Amazon buys Boston Dynamics, and then they have an army of little robot dogs, right? Like maybe that's the only thing that's missing. But what would Amazon not have? Assume it would probably be as close as any company to being able to get diplomatic immunity and kind of negotiate with nations, given its size and scale and reach and all the logistics it has and all the technology, right? It has like kind of a vertical, it's got an integrated supply chain. It seems like if any company was able to do that, it would be them. Why wouldn't it be a company?
Here's
what don't they have?
So I think it might be, you might set it up as a company like post the network state book. But Amazon itself, what do they lack? Well, think about the US government. It has tons of money, but could it do Amazon? It couldn't, right? So it lacks something, right? So the current Amazon, I think one way of thinking about it is it fundamentally lacked, it didn't have that social contract with its employees or with its customers to do something like this, okay? That would need to be, for example, when somebody joins Facebook, right? Even though people talk about, quote, Facebook as a country, you join Facebook, you're just there to poke and like. You're not there to like fold into Zuck as the president. You join Facebook, the company, that's a different social contract. You've gone in, you're getting paid more, but you're also folding into a hierarchy that Zuck is at the top of, right? Now, if you fuse those two things, right, a hierarchy that Zuck is at the top of, and the scale of Facebook.com as opposed to Facebook the company, then you start getting something that looks like a network state, but that's a totally different social contract. It's like everybody leaves, with immigration, they'll tell you to leave and then come back into the country and touch back. That's why it's like easier to have a new entity where that's a social contract from the beginning, and it's not a click-through. It's like a digital signature. There's an NFT. You're like, it's intentionally high friction process to apply to become a netizen. That's kind of how I think about it. That's why existing things, is it possible they might be retrofitted? Maybe, but I think you're going to need new things that show what it can be done, and then you'll get things that become intermediates, but that new pole has to be established. Like Bitcoin had to be established, and then you could do CBDCs and all these other intermediates, but you need the new pole first.
You can't necessarily pivot into a network state. Is that fair?
I won't say never, right? Yeah. But I do think that, for example, in the book I talk about why isn't Bitcoin a network state? Well, a currency is not the same thing as a country. It's a piece of a country. It's not the same thing. There is no territory, and there's no diplomatic recognition. You don't have the ability to build a self-driving car road. It is pieces of it, but not the same thing, right? And in ontologies, has-a is not the same as is-a, right? The relations differ.
Let's take it the other direction then. Are there close examples, or what is the closest initiative right now, project, team, organism, that has all the characteristics of a network state?
Great question.
Or have we not seen anything emerge yet because it's taken a little piece from here and here, but we haven't seen a full encapsulation?
Right. So if you go to thenetworkstate.com/dashboard, okay, we are now tracking 26 startup societies around the world. It's like CoinMarketCap for startup societies, one way of thinking about it. And this is actually a filtered list of a significantly longer list. And the thing that's cool about this is it shows two things. First is there are projects that are adjacent. They've raised a few $100 million total. It's like early crypto in some sense. To your point, if I was to make a checkerboard list of features, right, some of them have some pieces and not others, at least as I define them. And you might say, well, who cares about your definition, blah, blah, right? And my definition is based on, it's a summarization of a huge amount of history. And so you can disagree with it or whatever, but at least let me give my rationale for why it's there. Basically, if you look at state formation processes, right, we have one human lifetime, but there are about 100 billion humans who've ever lived. So going and learning from all of that past stuff, it's just like you look at you take a telescope, you look at distant, star systems, you're like, oh, that 2-star system, that actually works. I didn't know that was a solution to the equations of gravitation. In the same way, you can look back in time and you can be like, how were these states actually formed? How is this city that I live in, how was it actually created? There were men and women just like us who did that. The founding fathers were much younger than us, right? Many of them, they're in like their 20s or whatever, right? So this was possible at one time. How did it exactly happen? Because right now, we've got the fully baked cake, not how it happened. And what you will find is certain elements that I identify, most of the things that you would call near a network state, like a Google or what have you, Bitcoin, they don't have all these elements like a founder and a purpose and like diplomatic recognition is a big one, right? Some control over territory, all of those pieces, they don't have all of them. And so the things that are closer, I think like cul-de-sac is interesting. I think Kift is interesting. I think cul-de-sac, but it's like in one place, right? Pronomos and Praxis, they're like city-like things, which are great. Startup cities are great, but startup cities have the problem that by being in one place, you have the government around you is a monopoly provider of law. Whereas if you start cloud first, land last, and you have lots of pockets everywhere, now you only have one tendril down over here, and if the government gets adverse to you, you pull that tendril up and you relocate those people to one of your other 99 nodes around the world. Same logic as Bitcoin, right? So if there's various, I think, what do I call them, insights, at least things I recommend doing. One of the Satoshi's big realizations was everything previously with digital currency was all on centralized servers, right? And one of my realizations is everything previously with micronations and so on, everybody's like, oh, let me start with the land, start with the land. That like seems like the most obvious thing. You don't start with the land, you start with the cloud. Cloud first, land last, but not land never. And just that like starting place, you know how Thiel talks about starting things, it's like, it's hard to fix a bad start if you get it wrong. And that's why I think it's probably going to be from scratch things. Not gainsaying that somebody might pivot into it. I think it'll probably be a from scratch thing.
How do you get a scaled network state? Because when I think about the land first approach, at least you're kind of stuck with each other, right?
Right.
And there's a spectrum of countries, homogeneous. The U.S. is atypically heterogeneous and diverse as a country.
Right.
And you could argue that as diverse as we are, there's basically like 2 network states. Red and blue?
Yes, exactly.
Right?
That's right.
So how do you think about this mental model of like a network state versus like a network political party?
Sure.
And then is exit really just creating political factions or political disagreements in this kind of construct? Or is there like a Dunbar's number or something similar to like a network state? Because eventually you'll want to go with your herd and say, you know what, we were aligned, screw these guys, we're too big.
Right.
Want to splinter off.
So one of the things I mentioned in the book, and I'm going to elaborate on this much more in like the V2, is what the least popular but perhaps most important word in the world is?
What's that? The least popular?
The least popular but perhaps most important word in the world is recentralization. Okay? Why is it the least popular? So centralization, decentralization, recentralization. You have people who are advocates of centralization. In the book, I talk about the US establishment and the CCP in particular. But all these folks are like, look, the current system works. Just reform the current system. Get in line, you crazy people. Then you have the decentralists. And of course, I'm sympathetic to the decentralists. But some of them basically are like, no one should be in power. Everybody's equal. And you ain't the boss of me. Right? Which are 2 different like ways of sort of Russell conjugating the same concept of no one's in charge. No hierarchy is legitimate, right? We are all equal means no one's in charge. There's no one in power. You ain't the boss of me. No one's in charge. No one's in power, right?
Yep.
So I'm sympathetic to decentralization as a corrective to the current system. But then the reason it's the least popular word in the world is on the other side. If you look at history, right, you get recentralization. Now that can be the bad version of this is both the centralists and decentralists will say new boss, same as the old boss. The whole point is the new boss is not the same as the old boss. What happens is this thing no longer holds, so it breaks apart, and then people have a new rebirth where they regroup together in volitional units. Like you run out of a building after a fire alarm, and then you don't just spread to the 4 winds forever. You regroup, and then you rebuild the building afterwards, right? Maybe fire resistant this time. And there's this Chinese proverb, the empire long united must divide, long divided must unite. Right? Long united, everybody chafes at the centralization and so on. Long divided, everybody's like, oh my God, there's such a chaos and anarchy. We need like someone to bring order and so on. And if you look, just like you go from the mainframe to the PC to cloud to mobile, like there's cycles coexisting at the same time of both centralization and decentralization, even within tech, within our lifetime. So the thing is that that breaking up into those individual nations, the red and the blue in the U.S., but also other things in other countries, will be, for example, not red and blue, but you know who actually liked the network state, who wrote all about it? The Catalonians. Okay, all of these ethnic groups around the world, the United Nations is not really the United Nations. It's like the selected nations or the selected states. The president of Kazakhstan said, if every ethnic group around the world that deserved a state got one, that we'd have 600 countries, not 200, right? The Catalonians, the Basques, et cetera. So there are all these groups around the world that have a history and a culture that are legitimate nations, like nations under common consent, that don't have a state. They like this, and that's not red-blue. That's a different kind of thing. And they, this Catalonian nationalist said, look, we want to lobby for a state of our own, but this is a new method. We might be able to give up the land where we're currently on, but get a state somewhere else, just like there's more Irish people of Irish descent who live outside Ireland than live within it, right? Sometimes you compromise and you sacrifice, you can get something better, right? So that's why I don't think it's either hang on to the current system or anarchy. I think there's actually a new rebirth on the other side, though it'll be very messy.
Are these a threat to existing states?
I don't think of, some people will, of course, say everything's a threat. Like, the fact that you have end-to-end encrypted messaging is a threat. Everything is a threat to democracy, blah, right? Stable diffusion is being called a threat. Like, Facebook is being called a threat. Every technology you can think of, you can probably find someone call it a threat to democracy, right? Which is a longer conversation. But is competition a threat? Or is competition reform? Is competition good for you? Is it actually healthy for you in a sense? Does it, run a race and you're getting in shape too, right? It's kind of, you may not like it in the short run, but in the medium to long run, isn't it good that there are options? Does someone want to be a total monopoly? Do they want to be fat and happy? Do they want their citizens to live in a prison state? All the countries have made it hard for people to leave. Nazi Germany, they had this huge tax on Jewish people who tried to leave. Soviet Union did the same thing, actually also on Jewish people, and there had to be something called the Jackson-Vanik Amendment that let them leave, right? And those countries that lock in their people, in East Germany, the guns were pointed in. It wasn't about illegal immigrants, it was illegal immigrants. They're guys jumping over the wall to get out, right? Cuba, people drown trying to leave. North Korea, it's a giant prison state, right? And in China, they're doing some crazy lockdowns where people, you can't even get visas now to get out of the country, right? So those are the countries that are responding, quote, to competition in an unhealthy way. But the ones that are responding to it, I think, in a healthy way are those that are like, look, let's build an admirable society that attracts people and that is able to compete with this global, migrant market for talent. And that's the way that we'll actually build a better society. We'll know what people want. And I think that's a way of doing it versus like, oh, it's a threat in a zero-sum kind of way.
Are there any countries today that fit that bill as the benevolent, oh, we should welcome competition?
Well, so kind of, right? Well, yeah, here's why. Big countries don't. Small countries actually kind of do, right? Why? Because the remote economy is amazing for lots of small countries. For example, Thailand for a long time was sort of fighting the digital nomad thing. Now they're totally leaning in. They have a new thing where you can just apply online and get a 10-year visa to live and work in Thailand on their golden beaches. They're seeking not just, quote, wealthy people, but talented people. And they want 1 million people over the next 5 years. That's like 200,000 people a year. That's like on the order of 500 to 1,000 people a day admitted, which means they're going to get probably 10x that in terms of applicants. And this is going to just totally turbocharge their country. The UAE is doing something similar. Singapore is doing something similar called One Pass. This is a little bit of a rabbit hole, but the H-1B visa to the US is like, it's like a locked cell phone where the employee is just locked to that company, and for them to start a company or transfer, it's, people have called it indentured servitude or whatever. Obviously, there's benefits to people. They do the deal, but now there's a better deal on the table. Singapore One Pass lets you into the country, and it's like an unlocked cell phone. You can go start companies. They're basically just letting in the person, not the job, right? It's like a more enlightened way of doing it. And so now the U.S. finally has competition on its immigration system, which, by the way, is like San Francisco. San Francisco is a narco-tyranny. It's like the worst of both worlds. It's like the Uber driver gets like a $500 ticket. The guy who smashes his window, nothing happens to him, right? In the same way, the U.S. doesn't enforce on like human traffickers, but the guy who fills out all the forms is waiting, 10 years or 20 years for their stuff. That's massive deadweight loss. And now other countries are stepping up to compete, and that will reform in a good way, right? So go ahead.
Last question for you. About 10 years ago, you gave a presentation on cryptocurrencies. I forget what was the startup school?
Yeah. It was on exit. It was on a lot of these concepts.
It was on the concept of
Yeah.
exit. A good chunk of it was around cryptocurrencies. It was about exit more generally, but I think people latched onto the crypto elements. So if you take the 10-year view, you've been very prescient on a bunch of trends, putting the building blocks together. The specifics, no one's got a perfect crystal ball, right? And it kind of the journey towards these 10-year outcomes or these 10 years visions kind of take twists and turns, and you always
Sure.
update your theses as kind of new information becomes available. But I guess in the medium term, between now and the next mainnet, or over the course of the next 18 months, for the folks that are kind of building or really excited about this as a concept or something that they might be able to get on the ground floor on to help build out, what are the most important bits of infrastructure, the most important experiments that you think will realistically hit
Great question.
between now and the end of next year?
Between now and the end of next year. Okay, so.
Well, we know what the 10-year vision is.
Sure,
so
sure.
how do we start getting some of these MVPs?
So end of next year is a very concrete date. Let's say the next few
Couple
years.
years,
Okay,
okay,
right. So, number one, crypto phone. Insanely important. Your phone is basically your life. It is becoming more and more and more important.
Do you have your Solana phone yet?
So I want to get one, right? So, but basically, I want Solana to do one. I want others to do one. The reason is that's your wallet, and it's your identity, and it's your everything. And there's that nightmare story that recently came out of Google, seeing that someone had taken a photo of their kid for a doctor's visit, and it was called CSAM, right?
Yeah.
And they were locked out of their Google account and just shut down remotely in this nightmarish kind of thing when their doctor had asked them to do this, right? And so, of course, the false positive rate on this stuff is going to be like non-trivial, even if it's quote well-intentioned, right?
Yep.
And so, that's similar to what's going on in China, where in WeChat, if they just lock you out of WeChat, or they give you a red code, they do
Unplugged from the matrix.
You're basically you're just unpersoned. You have to sleep on somebody else's couch. You can't pay for things. It's like in the Black Mirror episode, the guy's blocked from the world, and he can't even see anybody.
John Hamm is just he's grayed out.
That's right. So that's a very dystopian thing that is happening. That's not like future. That's happening. It's just going to happen to a larger number of people. We're just arbitrary deplatforming by, does it really matter if it's the Chinese state or an American corporation that's doing it? It's just a completely unaccountable entity that you're just scratching on the outside of this thing that doesn't care about you, right? The crypto phone is like this critical piece of infrastructure.
So crypto phone.
Crypto phone.
And then ENS or some type of crypto identifier.
ENS and competitors to ENS, like the Solana name system, like Urbit, like other kinds of things. I like ENS. It's wonderful. It's a breakthrough. They deserve all the props. But it's also so important that it's like AT&T Unix. We need to have forks like Linux. Fork the namespace.
Yep.
So you have .eth and .a and .b and .c, either taking the smart contract or doing other things. Why? Because the administration of a namespace reflects a culture. We're very early in the whole space of names and crypto names, but just like John Smith reflects some great-great-great-grandfather was a blacksmith, or Harry Potter, okay, he's fictional, but someone was a potter somewhere, right? I do think that the surnames, your Ryan Selkis.eth, that surname of .eth will reflect a lot about you in the future. Okay, there's certain values that you hold, and so that namespace is like a lot of values there. Like .eth and .sol are kind of something, but you will have, that's like the surname for your digital passport. Like that's a namespace of your digital country. All the names come over here, right? And so that's number two, I think, crypto names. Okay, and then number three is the kind of stuff. I'm a seed investor in Instadap, but there's a lot of things like this that are basically building, crypto banking, which would go on your phone. Why? Because the financial system in both China and the US is increasingly being used as a political tool, because they can use it, they are using it. For example, you may have saw this thing yesterday with Jamie Dimon actually doing something good, where there's a congressperson who was saying, are you going to not fund, do you see this?
No, but the preface was what I was smiling at.
Right, yeah. So, look, I will praise when people I think are doing good. So, this congressperson was saying, oh, are you going to commit to not funding any oil and gas for net zero, blah, blah. And Jamie Dimon was like, no, we're not going to do that. In fact, that would be like hell on earth if we did that or something. He's basically like, this is totally ludicrous, not funding oil and gas in an energy crisis. You want to fund nuclear to get zero emission clean energy. You don't want to do this degrowth, push us back, decivilization type stuff, right? So the point is that they were trying to weaponize the financial system to jack up your gas prices even further, right? And in China, they're doing it against dissidents, and in the US, you can get deplatformed for more and more things. And so financial deplatforming is not just the next step, it's the already there step after social deplatforming. And so having that crypto bank on your phone with probably a, not just a stable coin that's pegged to a fiat currency, but maybe something like Frax, which is a genuinely like a flat coin, like a crypto asset that's flat, like a small country's asset, effectively. Now you can have banking that is totally independent of both the Chinese system and the American system, and you can't just be deplatformed, right? So that combination of things is your phone, your name, your bank account, and what that leads you to is, I wouldn't quite call it sovereign individual because it's hard for an individual to be truly sovereign. You saw that email from Steve Jobs where he's like, I don't cook my own, like I don't make my own beef, and he talks about his dependency, right? There is the dependency of the individual on this supply chain around them. You can't really be a mountain man. I mean, the Unabomber did, but he reduced his standard of living, right? But what this does with the cryptophone and the names and the banking is you can be just mobile. If this, mobility is leverage against the state. If the state turns against you, you're out. Right?
Yep.
And that is being the guarantor of human rights. It is in the UN human rights. That's what we need to protect with technology.
Balaji, always a pleasure. And you know what? We packed a lot into like 25 minutes. I don't know how the fuck I could go another 2 hours with you, but you always do like 3-4 hour interviews, and Tim Ferriss has all the adrenaline in the world, so I don't know how he does it.
We got a 10-hour with Lex Friedman coming out.
Although we do 2 hours every year when I drop the thesis, so we'll do that maybe in December, and we'll get an update here. But for now, Balaji, back in the flesh in the US. Welcome home. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks.